All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Evernest Real Estate Investor Podcast. I am one of your hosts, Spencer Sutton, and I have back with me today, Gray Hall. Gray, welcome back to the show.
I think you're in a really good mood today. That's probably one of your peppiest intros ever.
Well, I got a haircut and I had a good workout, so maybe my endorphins are kicking, I guess.
See, mine are sucked low. It has been about 80, 90 degrees, and it is almost snowing outside. So we got a little cold front coming through. So kind of gloomy down here. So I appreciate you bringing up my spirits.
Yeah. The difference between Denver and Birmingham right now, I heard that is looked like it might snow today in Denver. So
yeah, just 2 days. I just planted all these plants in the yard. So hoping that doesn't kill them. That would be quite the bummer.
Well, if they don't kill them, your dog will, I'm sure. So that is the way it goes.
Absolutely true. That is how you lose money right there, is you get a dog. So
that's right. But they bring you so much joy. All right. So today, Gray, you and I were talking about this subject, and I thought it was, I think this is a really a good subject to discuss, because I think that not a lot of investors, when they go into this, think about this enough, probably. I mean, they do think about it, but they don't think about it enough. They're always thinking about getting a resident in the home. But what we want to talk about today is how we keep residents in houses, like long-term, because the number one killer of investment returns is vacancy, right? It's the turn. And so if you have a resident, and let's just say you have a resident that flips, we call them churn, they flip every single year, you will likely lose money. So
you're going to sell that property. You're going to stop investing in real estate.
You're going to go, I am done with this. The market's good. I'm selling this house. There's no doubt. So let's talk about this.
Because I think that and I think it will prove out on the spreadsheet, but I think that this is kind of a conceptual thing, but I think it's really important to understand, whether you're managing yourself or you have a property manager, the number one way to kill your return, or the number one way to maximize your return, is to keep a tenant in the house. Keep a tenant keep taking care of the house, that's paying market rent in the house. If you've got a tenant who's churning every year, I mean, just kind of thinking about it, you've got the time it takes to market. You're not going to put it up and sign a lease, tenant move in next day. That would probably be not a good case if a tenant had to move in that quickly anyway. So you got that time. You've also got repairs. And so what we see is, no matter when a tenant moves out, you're probably going to have some small stuff, some touch up, some cleaning. So just thinking about that, depending on how long the tenant has been there. So you're going to incur expenses. So you've got time, which you're paying the mortgage on the house if you've got a loan on it. You got the opportunity cost of missed rent, plus you have additional maintenance. And then what is your time worth? And so every time a tenant moves out, you've got those kind of four components that are eating away at your returns. And so, love kind of talking through, hey, how do we keep tenants in the house, and kind of some strategies around that.
Let me ask you this question, because what you said kind of triggered something in me. When investors are typically doing their pro formas and getting this out, what do you think they typically have in their spreadsheets for occupancy, like for tenancy? Like how long do they typically look out and say, hey, I'm going to keep this tenant X amount of time, years?
So I've seen it range from 2.5 years up to 4. I haven't really seen anybody go past that. And so you kind of want to spread it out, because you're going to have vacancy on the front end. So let's say you buy the property. Mm-hmm. It might take you 60 days before it's, like, best case, let's say it's rent ready. You put it on the market. It takes you, 20 to 30 days to find a tenant, and then they've got their lease and they move in 30 days. So your first rent payment's not really going to come from 60 days. And so you'll spread out that 60 days over 2, 3, 4 years. And that kind of is how you back into the vacancy. I think it would be really, if you're estimating 7 years, we're just not seeing that. We're seeing tenants stay an average of 3 to 4 years. And so I think it's good to kind of know and model your vacancy after that.
Well, you're saying residents are staying, 3, 4 years. Is that with a particular class of property, or is that, because I know that I've had in one of my rental houses, a resident that stayed there 9 years. I had one that stayed there 10 years. I'm not saying that was the norm, but but these happen to be low to moderate income. And so what I've thought is, when you're in the B class, the A class, you tend to see people move a little bit more. Do you think that's true or not?
I do, because I think class like D and C class, maybe more workforce housing, lower income housing, there's a lot of that population that's perpetual and lifetime renters. And so the reason that they move out of the house is to move into another rental house. And so that could be things that the landlord didn't take care of, maintenance, et cetera. In the B and the A class, especially the A class, you've probably got people renting where they might be building a house and they want to rent an A class property, and that's going to be short term. Or they might be young professional, young family, where they might have roommates, and eventually they're going to move out and buy houses. That's just kind of typically what we see across the segment. So A and B are going to have higher vacancy, like lower terms of staying, and then typically the C class properties is where you're going to have people who stay longer, especially if they like the house and it's in a good area. You're not seeing those. Typically, we haven't seen those types of classes of houses move as much.
Yeah, I do think, like, I've got a friend here in Birmingham, and he does a good bit now of lease to purchase in those C class areas. So people who are interested in buying, don't want to go typically the traditional route, he'll do that for them. So yeah, okay, interesting. So I think really when we start this conversation for investors, I think probably one of the most important things is for investors to have a mindset shift, because I know when I, started buying rental houses, it was all about the rental house. It was all about, and that is the focus when you're out there hunting down deals. Like, you are looking for these rental houses. Now, obviously you're looking at these rental houses with residents in mind. Like, is this a good setup? No, I don't want any houses. I don't want any properties with steep driveways. I don't want any properties with funky layouts. I don't want anything near train tracks. So you are thinking about the resident a little bit, but then when your resident gets in, something that we've talked about a lot at Evernest over the years is the resident being the number one asset, right? So the resident is the asset. The house is not necessarily your asset. It's that resident. So talk a little bit about that, kind of that mentality for investors.
I think your mindset shifts. So I think when you're in acquisition mode and you're looking to buy houses, you're focused on the right things. The location of the house, the resale of the house, the maintenance of the house. You start to think about the layout. I mean, it's a strange thing, but if you got a house that's all chopped up and funky, a tenant might not enjoy living there for the long term. So I think having your focus on the house and the location and acquisition stage is good, but you got to shift once the tenant in there. What we've seen investors do is, hey, we've got at least out of sight, out of mind. And well, that should be the case when issues come up, be thinking about the tenant, proactively thinking about ways that you can kind of keep the tenant in there. And so you can kind of shift, because if you're building a portfolio, you're going to be shifting between those two things. And so it's kind of two different skill sets and kind of two different mindsets. But the tenant really is a very, very important thing, because at that moment, and kind of given where that asset is at, that property, keeping the tenant in there is the one thing that you can do to make yourself the most money. When you're acquiring, buying the right house is the one thing that you can do to make the most money. So shifting between those two is very important.
Okay. So so what we really want to talk about is we want to talk about this occupancy period, right? So we're really interested. We have other podcasts talking about our entire leasing process, how we screen tenants, all of that. I encourage you to go back and listen to that. We had Jacob West on the podcast talking about that, but really what we're concerned about, what we're going to be talking about, is this occupancy stage, and understanding that resident is so very important. Probably. So let's kind of get into stage one. So what we're going to do is we're going to list out several ways that you can set yourself up for success and keep this resident long-term. So the initial move in, lease signing, let's talk about that, Gray. Like, how do we approach, how should an investor approach this, initial stage of the resident's occupancy?
So you're setting up, expectations, and it starts with a couple of different places. So one, making sure your lease is clear on what you're going to handle, and that you follow up on that, what the tenant's going to handle. So I think getting a good solid lease that is fair to both parties, but protects both parties and sets clear expectations is the first thing. And then the second thing is setting expectations. When is move-in? Make sure you execute on that. What condition is the house? What repairs are you going to do before the house? Start setting those expectations with the tenant. When does the tenant owe you things? what things do they need to do before moving. And so you want to get that relationship off on the right foot. Like you want to have your ducks in a row so that you can communicate. You want to have a process and you want to run this like a business so that there's predictable outcomes, because that's what we're talking about here. We want predictable outcomes where tenants enjoy the experience of leasing and renting from you and living in that house. And it starts there. So starting with the lease, and then it starts with the move-in process. And a big part of that is making sure the house is move-in ready. Because the last thing that we want is a tenant to move in, they pay all this rent, they pay a deposit, they've got a mover, and they move in and you get a laundry list of 50 items. I've gotten those before and it is not fun. And all of a sudden you're thinking, well, crap, this tenant is already going to be looking out for, or hey, the work wasn't done right, or all these other things. And so I think getting ahead of that and kind of knowing to expect that and doing everything possible to avoid that is probably the best strategy right before a tenant moves in.
Okay, so let's back up to what you said about like setting expectations. Is this something, would you advise, I'm thinking about real estate investors when they're living in town, maybe they bought a house within their city or something. Would you suggest them sitting down with a resident and literally walking through the lease to set those expectations and just kind of pointing out different areas? Hey, we're going to do this. You're responsible for this. Or, I mean, I would just imagine so much, everything's DocuSign and that you just kind of assume that they're going to read all of that themselves.
Well, don't assume. I've signed thousands of leases with tenants, and we used to sit there in the office and kind of go through it with them. And some tenants they flip to the next page and sign the whole thing. What we did was create basically like a top 10 practices and kind of put the highlights in there. I think that's summarize things, because documents can be long and lengthy. Summarize the things and set expectations and make sure they sign off on that. I don't think you need to sit down with every single tenant. A lot of this stuff, especially if you're living out of state or if you've got a PM, we might be sending DocuSigns to tenants, but I do think it is a good reminder to set up in the lease, have a summary section of, hey, these are the really important things that you need to be focused on. And then communicating again, like even before move-in, we send a move-in to remind them of the really important things. So continue to draw attention of like what they need to do, what the expectations are from both parties.
Yeah, I like that idea of taking what may seem like a pretty complicated legal document to them that they just want to sign and get over with so they can get the house, especially in a hot rental market where houses are flying, where we're renting houses so fast. They're like, hey, just let me sign it. Let me sign it. I would caution against, and you can give your opinion here, against letting people lease your house without them even seeing the property. Like, talk about the danger there.
We have seen that too many times. Maybe somebody's moving in. One, they haven't checked out the area. And so what we started doing is getting a sight unseen to them. We know that happens, especially in the past couple of years. People have been moving states. We know that can happen from time to time, but the last thing that you want is to spend all this time, energy, and effort, sign the lease, they pay the money, and then they're disappointed by the house. So we've got a sight unseen to them that basically says, hey, you're agreeing to the condition of the property, assuming it's safe, sanitary, secure, and you're acknowledging that you didn't see the property and you're leasing the sight unseen. So I think that is a really important part. And you do want the tenant you want them to know what they're getting into in the house, because you can't change the layout and the square footage of the house. And if they get in there expecting it to be, whatever, 5 bedrooms and it's only 3, that's going to be a sore disappointment. And they're probably not going to stay there very long. Like, that's not in your best interest either, is you don't want to lease to a resident, who doesn't kind of know what they're getting into.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. So setting expectations, then you mentioned making sure that the house is like, everything is okay, good with the house. Now, what I've discovered is that, what I would pass in my house doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to let it pass in a rental house, right? So Allison has been on me for a while to fix, this garage door, or something's going on with the garage door. I don't, it's my house. I don't really there's not a sense of urgency for me, but if it's your rental house, it absolutely needs to be have a sense of urgency, because residents they're going to call anything in that is not perfect. And that literally will set your relationship up with this kind of awkward kickoff, which is not good.
And I think being prepared for that, we've seen a lot of people get into real estate investing where they'll buy a house as a primary resident and then they'll move out. I did that, and that's how I got started. I've realized that I've got low attention to detail. And also when it's your house, you just don't care about some things. I think everybody's kind of wired different. I've got friends who are engineers and they just think I'm insane for letting some things kind of go. But it's not a big deal to me, but it might be a big deal to your tenant. So you can't have the same expectations that you had in your house. We've seen some frustrations around that of an owner, will take on management. They moved out of the house. The tenant gets in and sends a list of 15 things. And they say, those weren't a problem for me, therefore they shouldn't be a problem for the tenant. And that's just not reality. So I would say like walking through the house and probably getting somebody else to walk through the house and point out things, because you're either you just renovated the house yourself, you paid a contractor, you might be really focused on this one thing, but a fresh set of eyes could like bring a different set to that. But you also want to be checking the faucets. Are things leaking? Are the doorknobs loose? Are the doors sticking? That's a big one that I didn't catch in my house. Like I was fine, just kind of slam the door or have to lift it up and kind of jimmy a certain way. But a tenant expects certain things to work, and those might be small things, and they might be, kind of a nuisance to you to really fix. But little things like that add up in the tenant's mind, whether they're enjoying the house or not.
Yeah, so in our walkthroughs before a resident moves in, we are doing everything. We're flushing every commode. We are turning on every faucet. We're checking to make sure the hot water works. The last thing you want is somebody to have a full day of moving in a home and they can't take a hot shower. So we're flipping every light switch, looking at all, making sure even all the light bulbs are proper, right? We're looking in the attic, we're looking in the basement, we're doing everything. So this is really, really important for you. The best thing is for this resident to move in and you not hear anything besides, hey, I'm all moved in, thumbs up, everything's good. That's what you really want to hear.
Yeah, you do. And I think you can accomplish that. And another benefit of doing that checklist, especially taking photos, is to know the condition at the beginning. That's going to help you when the tenant moves out 3 or 4 years down the road and y'all agree on the condition of the house. One thing that we have tenants do is send them a move-in checklist, and they'll go through and write down everything that's wrong in the house. That doesn't mean they want us to fix it, but there's a scratch on the hardwood floors. They'll put that in there. That way we won't charge them when the tenants move out. Again, that sets the expectation of, hey, this is the condition of the house now. 3 or 4 years down the road, when you move out, we knew that was an issue before. But getting off on the right foot, I don't have the data on this, but I would probably wager to say that there's a correlation between number of work orders submitted at move-in and length of tenancy. I think that would be a really interesting stat to see.
It would.
I don't know if any of our maintenance partners are tracking that, but it's kind of like anecdotally and gut feeling. You get off on the better foot with the tenant, and they're probably going to treat the house better if they feel like somebody went through and checked the house on the front end.
And honestly, you as an investor, you start having a bad attitude when you get a long list of things that need to be fixed. I mean, you really do start getting a bad attitude. You're like, crap, this is going to be like, I'm going to get this every month. And so again, you do not want to have this adversarial role, because this resident is your asset. Yep. So you can eliminate all of that on the front end by doing the work, making sure everything's good. Okay. So now that they're in the home, and I do want to come back to something. Don't let me forget this towards the end, because I do want to something, when you talked about residents moving out, I want to come back and circle around and talk about what we would charge a resident for versus not, right? So normal wear and tear versus, hey, this is some wear and tear that was, or something that the tenant calls that they need to pay for. So I want to come back to that. But now the resident's in the house. How do we keep them? How do we make this a pleasant experience for them? Knowing that, houses are going to have problems, people are going to have issues. So let's talk about this. How do we make sure that they have a great experience and we keep them long-term?
The main time, I think it's the beauty of long-term rentals, is it's a lot of work on the front end to get the property renovated and leased. Once the tenants are in there, they're responsible for at least single family lawn care and, general upkeep and keeping the house clean, et cetera. So the times that they reach out is really around maintenance. You might have some other times that, something else is kind of going on, but like the number one time that we talk to residents and owners of properties is when maintenance comes up. So even with a new construction house, once you're outside that 1-year builder warranty, there's going to be small stuff that needs to be fixed. I mean, that's just the reality of a depreciating asset like a house. So I think one, when you underwrote the property, did you put enough maintenance reserves in there that you're not freaking out every time something goes wrong? And then two, what's your process to handle it? So if you're managing a property yourself, where do the tenants let you know about maintenance? Do they have a process where you can get that? Are you able to handle that quickly and timely? And do you have a list of vendors that you can send out there to fix things quickly? Speed is the number one reason of maintenance that you can frustrate and make a tenant mad if it takes, a week for hot water to be resolved. And so I think speed is the number one thing. So what is your process for handling maintenance?
Yeah, especially on like emergency issues, like emergency plumbing issues, HVAC issues. With managing as many houses as we do, we're always going to have issues with heating and air elements or air units in July, around July 4th. Like it's just going to happen. And so do you have a process for handling those things quickly and efficiently? Because you're right. I think just, man, it's frustrating for them. It's frustrating for you when all these things go wrong. And I think also knowing yourself well enough. So whether you want to do it yourself or like pass it off to a property manager. My brother called me last night. He lives in Nashville and he's like, hey, thinking about renting my house. And could he rent it himself? Yeah, because he's going to stay in the same vicinity. He's not going to be far from this house. He lives in the same little community, but he's like, I know myself well enough. I don't want to deal with anything. So I want you all to do it if I end up renting my house. And so for you investors listening, know yourself. Like know yourself well enough to know, I love this. I'm going to enjoy this. I want to make this a great experience for them. Or I would rather focus on acquisition and building my portfolio and let somebody else handle that. So somebody who maybe has processes in place.
Yeah. The other thing is preventative maintenance. So there's reactive maintenance, and this is what we're talking about here. So do you have a list of vendors to handle? Communicate really clearly and consistently with tenants. If there's going to be a vendor there, letting them know when the vendor is going to be there, coordinating access to it, letting them know if the vendor can't get there today. I think communication is where we've dropped the ball and where tenants get frustrated. And I've seen that happen. Like when you don't communicate, like even if you can't get somebody out there right now, communicating what to do in the meantime and when to expect somebody is really key. So if you can do both of those things, if you got a vendor list of people, a plumber, a backup plumber, and a backup to the backup, you'll be in good shape. And if you communicate to the residents, like when to expect. The other thing is preventative maintenance. And so we want to get ahead and prevent reactive, because when it's reactive, it's going to cost more. It's going to be more stressful. And there's just a sense of urgency. So when your water heater goes out on a Friday evening, you're going to be paying, weekend rates on a Saturday. And sometimes state law doesn't allow for those things to wait until Monday or during business hours where you can get the better rate. So things like when you're checking the house before move-in, preventative stuff that we do is checking the HVAC in the spring and the fall. So you want to check the AC in the spring because we know that they're going to fire up that system. And if there's any issues, you can get ahead of it. You might have some time to fix it while they're not using it. Same thing with the furnace in the fall, right before it starts to get cold, depending on your market, September to October, checking it, changing the furnace, paying somebody. You'll typically have lower maintenance costs overall. So you're incurring a cost of paying somebody up there and inspect it. In the long run, you're going to maintain the unit, which preserves the house, preserves your investment. You have less CapEx, and you're going to get ahead of these issues. And so instead of paying for that repair in an emergency timeframe and being stressed out, because we all know that these things happen when you go on vacation or on the weekends. So probably the two most common times, or at least it feels like that. So I think there's a lot of preventative maintenance stuff that you can do, and would really recommend putting a process in place of when you're going to do those things to get ahead of them so you're not being reactive.
Yeah, that's great. Great advice. So preventative maintenance, communicate well, making sure you're taking care of everything before the resident moves in, have processes in place. What about, I was thinking about this because we interviewed a veteran in the property management industry many years ago. His name's Robert Locke. He used to own a property management company in Atlanta. And he one day got a notice that a tenant was going to vacate one of his properties, and he realized that he had that tenant in there for 20 years. And so he was like, oh my goodness, what did I do to keep that tenant 20 years? And he went back and kind of looked back at all the things. And one of the things that he noticed, the reason why they were able to keep tenants, is they appreciated a lot of their tenants in different ways. And when we were smaller, Gray, do you remember what we would do when we sat around the the table in the conference room in the Birmingham office? What did we used to do to show kind of appreciation?
Handwritten cards. I still remember showing up to meetings, not having done those, and hating feeling like I had not executed.
Yeah, getting in trouble. So we used to write handwritten cards and send them to residents. And a lot of times we would send gift cards just kind of randomly or on their birthday. We would send gift cards and say, hey, here's a $20 Starbucks gift card on us. Hope you enjoy coffee or whatever. So if you're managing 5 to 10 properties of your own or whatever, you can do that, right? You're going to know their birthdays because you're going to have all that information through the application. You're going to be able to do small things like that if you do them, chances are that's not ever been done before from a landlord for them. And so they'll remember that. Now, will that keep them in the house? I think you got to combine it with everything else that we've talked about, but I do think that just kind of adds a touch that they might not get somewhere else.
You can't just not fix the hot water and send them a $25 Starbucks gift card and cover all the sins.
Well, I'll tell you what we used to do, though. This is the truth. We would look and make sure that we're not sending things to people who were delinquent, right? Like they hadn't paid. They like ghosted us, and we're like, hey, they're in collections. We're trying to collect money from them. We're not sending them a gift card.
Yeah, so, I've heard owners doing that. I don't know the success of it, but I think they're goodwill if you kind of want to do that. I've had owners say, hey, can you send a tenant a gift card around Christmas? Or I think small things like that. I think that tenants want a place to live that works. Mm-hmm. I think at the end of the day, if you can provide those two things, you're kind of putting your best foot forward to keep a tenant in the house and not have them move out.
All right. So let's talk about towards the end of what we would call the tenant life cycle. What about renewal? How do you handle renewal to try to keep a resident especially in a hot market when rental rates are rising? You want to increase your rents. More than likely, you want to increase the returns on your property. So how do you handle that and still keep a happy resident?
Yeah, you're basically at a negotiation every year. So let's say you sign a lease, 12-month lease. We reach out 120 days out. We want to get ahead of that and know what the tenant's plans are. So I think one is, have the tenants taking care of the house? Is it somebody you want to renew to? If yes, what's the market rate done? What are they paying right now versus what's on the market? If there's a big delta, so the past 2 years, we've seen rents really grow and somebody might be paying $900, market rent is $1,200. It's a math problem at that point. At what point are you willing to let the tenant move out, incur the cost of a rehab or a turn, the vacancy, plus your time? And so what is that worth? Likely the numbers will shake out where you can meet in the middle. You might not raise all the way to your market rent, but the tenants they know that if they're going to move, they're going to have to pay that rent somewhere else. So finding a good kind of happy medium and talking with the tenants. I've seen places where the rents jumped up, extreme examples, but $1,000 a month. And so if I'm an owner looking at that, I'm like, I'm going to set it at market rent. If they want to move out, great. I'll find another tenant for that because you're obviously in a hot market. But it's a negotiation. I think getting ahead of that, sending them, hey, this is the market rent. If you guys want to renew, great. If not, hey, we've enjoyed keeping y'all as residents. That's simply the best strategy. Reach out early, reach out often. You want as much lead time to plan for if a tenant is going to move out so you can schedule vendors to get in there, schedule marketing, et cetera.
Do you think that who's more price sensitive to these types of things? Do you think that investors that have properties in CD areas are probably less likely to increase as much versus maybe B class properties, or do you mean?
I don't know. I think it's a good question. I mean, I would look at what did it take me to rent the house at last time. Mm-hmm. I think more so if you are buying multifamily property, the value of those buildings are derived based on net operating income. Mm-hmm. And depending on what the current market cap rate is, like a $100 a month increase can be a big value out, maybe $20,000 on the back end. So it's different. Like you got to look at your goals. Are you in this for the long run and you're looking for cash flow and you're looking to scale a portfolio? Might make sense just to keep the tenant in there. If you're looking to sell a property and want the highest amount of rent, you need to get that in there. So I think those kind of things factor in. I don't know about the C and the B class, but that kind of made me thought about that. I mean, we can't give blanket advice, but we can tell you, hey, if you're wanting to hold this, it just is a math problem at the end of the day. What's market rent on kind of the mid case, a conservative rent number you can rent it for? How long is it going to take to rent that? And are you going to come out, ahead in the end?
Yeah. And thinking about how much repair maintenance you're going to have to do in that property. Something I would say this also, I'm just thinking of investors who are buying portfolios where they're already, there's already people in there. There's already residents. Let's say you buy a 20 house package and you've got residents that are already in there. You really need to know the condition of these properties. You need to know deferred maintenance. You need to know all of these things. I know it's kind of dicey when investors are like, well, I really don't want you walking through all these houses. I've got residents in there. I don't want you disturbing them. But I'm telling you, you absolutely need to know what's going on with these properties, because they could all be moving out because they've had a horrible experience and you wouldn't even know it. Anyway, just want to throw that out there. All right. So we're coming to the close there. Let's just say they're moving out. I want to go back to the question that I, essentially reminded myself of. Gray, how are we making sure that we're being fair with a really good resident? Let's say they've lived there for 4 or 5 years. You took all the pictures, the condition of the property. What do these investors need to think about? Like what they're going to charge the resident for versus what they're going to say. They're just going to chalk it up to, you know what? It's normal wear and tear. It is what it is, and I'll handle it. Yeah,
this is a tough one. There's kind of gray area stuff. I think there's blatant stuff like hole in the wall, door ripped off the door frame.
Right.
Charging a tenant for that every single day.
Kids have drawn all over one of the walls. Yes, I get that for sure.
Scuffs on the hardwood floors. What was the condition? I mean, I think if they live there for 4 years and it's a high traffic area, what do you do? Paint. This is another big one, like holes in the wall. I mean, you want tenants to live in the houses, and they might hang up some pictures on the wall and put some nails in the wall. If they put 5 nail holes, are you going to charge them? I've seen one where they put 55 and you've got to basically spackle and drywall and repaint the whole room. So I would start with like, what are your state laws? Like in Colorado, the judges, if it ever made it to court, would look at carpets depreciated on 7 years. So if the carpet was replaced last year and you had a dog that chewed it up and tore it up and went to the bathroom on it, you have to replace it. You can charge them for basically, 6/7 of the year of just you depreciate it by a year. And so I think starting from like, hey, what are the state laws? And, property manager, if you got experience, you can kind of reach out to them and know that. And the other is, it's kind of tough. I think blatant things, I would err on the side of, if it was blatant tenant damage and it's in the lease of what the expectations are, goes back to setting clear expectations.
Yep, that's right.
Charge it. But there is a heavy amount of, hey, this is a cost of doing business. And so when you're underwriting your models, building in tenant turns every 3 to 4 years.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking like, if you're an investor and you're renting 1 or 5 houses, I think, to your point, setting those expectations, like, hey, here's the condition of the property. These are the things that we're going to charge you for if upon move out there's this going on or this happening or this happening. So you're right. It really does go back to communication and just being super open and transparent with all of that on the front end.
Yeah. And I think another way to create a good experience is like periodically checking in your house, at least annually, if not more frequently. You can get ahead of stuff. I mean, landscaping is a big one out here in Colorado. It's a very dry climate. And if you're not running the sprinklers, the landscaping can die. And so getting ahead of that, knowing the condition of the house, you either going ahead and fixing things ahead of time or reminding tenants like, hey, this needs to be repaired before you move out. So the standard is basically return the house to the condition that you moved in at, less wear and tear. And the less wear and tear is where the gray area is on that, because 2 different parties are going to have 2 very different opinions of that, in my experience. And so I would err on the side of, if it's really close, don't charge the tenants. The last thing you want to do is get a small claims court from a tenant because you withheld something. It's more brain damage than it's worth. And so you just want it to be fair to both parties.
That's right. Yep, that's good. Well, good deal. Well, Gray, this has been good. I hope you who are listening have enjoyed this episode. You can take some of these things with you, whether you're renting yourself. We do hope that if you're listening to this podcast and you're in any of our markets, if you have rentals in any one of our markets, we would love to talk to you about our property management services. Or if you're looking for properties. Gray's team on our brokerage division, they are helping investors every single day find rental properties, build portfolios. So reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you. And if you haven't already, leave us a review. We'd love to hear from you. And we'll be back next week with another episode of the Evernest, a Real Estate Investor.